What if the most powerful performances in British cinema were delivered by men quietly losing control of their own bodies? Behind every thundering voice and dignified stare was a secret, a limp, a tremor, a missing sense, or a pain too personal to name. These weren't just actors. They were masters of concealment. And their greatest role? Pretending nothing was wrong. Tonight we pull back the curtain on the legends who never let you see them falter. Until now. This is 17 old British actors with secret disabilities and deformities, and none of them ever broke character. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe, especially if you love stories that peel back the polished surface and find the fractures underneath. And while you're here, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now? We're always curious who's up late with us, chasing ghosts behind the spotlight. 1. Sir Alec Guinness. Sir Alec Guinness had a face made for mystery. Not in the cartoonish way, no circus scars or Bond villain burns, but in the quietly unreadable way, like an old cathedral window darkened just enough that you're never sure what's looking back. His roles were rarely about him. They were about the masks, the monk, the spy, the colonel, the ghost. But behind all that, there was always a sense that Guinness saw something others didn't, or more precisely, saw less of what they did. He'd injured his eye when he was a boy, a random childhood accident, barely a blip on a wartime medical chart, but the damage never fully healed. For most of his life, Alec Guinness lived with partial vision in one eye, which subtly altered his perception of depth, light, and movement. It was never publicly emphasized. Why would it be? He didn't need pity. He needed shadows. And Hollywood, or Ealing Studios more precisely, was more than happy to keep the lighting moody and the camera respectful. What's rarely discussed is how this minor optical flaw, this mild asymmetry, made him a master of the uncanny. In his most famous roles, he has a stare that never quite matches. One eye commits, the other waits. In The Bridge on the River Kwai, he walks the tightrope between mad pride and tragic dignity. In Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, his George Smiley doesn't blink unless he's planning to betray you. The imbalance of vision becomes the balance of performance. A man who sees the world askew learns to speak in code. Later in life, he would suffer from chronic mobility issues, a kind of slow betrayal by the same legs that once marched through sandstorms and sound stages. But Guinness treated it all with the same austerity he gave to fame. No complaint, no confession, just the steady erosion of flesh wrapped in dignified denial. The real illusion wasn't his disguise. It was the assumption that we ever saw him clearly to begin with. And then there's Peter Sellers, a man who changed faces so often he forgot which one was originally his, until his body decided to start removing them for him. 2. Peter Sellers. Peter Sellers was born with too many voices in his head. He just figured out how to bill for them. To the public, he was a comic genius, a one-man costume department capable of swinging from Pink Panther idiocy to Kubrickian satire without skipping a beat. But to those who knew him best, Peter was less a performer and more a haunted radio, constantly changing frequencies, never fully tuned in. Behind the scenes, Sellers was riddled with contradictions. He suffered from chronic anxiety and deep, untreated depression, but hid it behind outrageous personas. He was adored by fans for his chaotic charm, but terrified his friends with his volcanic mood swings. And while most knew of his artistic instability, fewer knew about his failing heart. Literally. By the time he was 38, Sellers had already had his first major heart attack. Over the next decade, he'd have more, some so severe that they briefly clinically killed him. The man who could fake any accent, mimic any tic, could no longer fake a steady pulse. His doctors begged him to slow down. His psyche begged him to disappear. But Sellers, ever the masochistic showman, just built another character to keep the machine running, You see, he didn't just play damaged men. He was them. In being there, he portrayed a blank cipher of a man, so emotionally vacant that others projected wisdom onto his emptiness. Critics called it the performance of his career. Friends called it a documentary. There's a long-standing theory in psychology that comedians use humor to shield trauma. Sellers didn't shield it. He weaponized it. Every punchline was a cry for help with perfect timing. Every sketch, a confession through the safety glass of satire. What made him brilliant made him brittle. What made him famous made him fractal. And when his heart finally gave out for good in 1980, the world mourned a legend. But few mourned the man. Because nobody really knew who he was, not even Peter. And then there's Laurence Olivier, a man who could control armies on stage but couldn't stop the trembling in his own hands. If you're still with us after these first two, you've already seen how much gets buried beneath the brilliance. So if you haven't yet, hit subscribe for more stories that linger in the shadows. And while you're here, drop a comment. Where are you watching from, and what time is it in your corner of the world? We like to know who's wide awake while the legends whisper. 3. Laurence Olivier. Laurence Olivier was the kind of man who made acting look like a divine sport. Part athleticism, part alchemy, part unspoken dare. On stage, he could summon Greek tragedy with a single syllable. On screen, he could make a raised eyebrow feel like the shifting of tectonic plates. He was the golden standard of British theater, which is to say, he had to pretend he wasn't dying half the time. For all the pomp and praise, Olivier was constantly playing defense against his own body. He suffered from chronic asthma, the kind that doesn't care if you're halfway through Hamlet's monologue or if you're just trying to breathe between rehearsals. He coughed through soliloquies. He gasped between curtain calls. He had entire performances where the air in the room was more dangerous than the critics in the balcony. But asthma wasn't his only unwanted co-star. Olivier also developed an essential tremor, a neurological condition that caused his hands to shake, which is particularly inconvenient when your entire reputation depends on emotional control and royal gestures. His hands, once precise instruments of Shakespearean authority, began betraying him in quiet, merciless ways. Wine glasses rattled, sword hilts slipped. Subtlety, his signature, became harder to stage. So what did he do? He acted harder, louder, bigger. He built physicality into his roles not just to elevate the character, but to bury the twitch. Every flourish became both art and camouflage. He wasn't overacting. He was hiding. It's a strange truth of performance. Sometimes the most flamboyant choices are made by people trying to distract you from their most fragile truths. He never publicly addressed the tremor, never admitted the asthma shaped his pacing. Instead, he left a trail of legendary roles and perfectly polished masks, so convincing that even those closest to him weren't sure which parts were deliberate and which were survival. Because that's the cruel trick of being brilliant. The world expects precision, but the body just does what it wants. And that brings us to Sir Michael Redgrave, a man who refused to let his hands shake, even when the disease took everything else first. 4. Sir Michael Redgrave. Sir Michael Redgrave looked like a man made out of stained glass and British gilt. Tall, dignified, and sculpted for tragedy, he was one of those actors who always seemed to know the end of the story before the first line was even spoken. He moved like a man who'd just seen the ghost in the wings. But for Redgrave, the real haunting came from within. By the late 1960s, Michael Redgrave had been diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. Quietly, privately, desperately. In a time when any hint of physical or mental weakness was a career death sentence, Redgrave chose the only option he felt he had: denial on the record, survival in practice. Parkinson's isn't theatrical. It doesn't give you the dignity of drama. It gives you slowness, shaking, the erosion of rhythm, which, for an actor, is like losing your pulse. Redgrave, who once spoke verse with the velocity of a hurricane, began to falter. Words stuck. Gestures wobbled. His voice, so famously commanding, began to sound like it had lost its place in the script. But he refused to quit. Instead, he modified his style. Slower roles, quieter parts, characters with gravitas so heavy it masked the pauses. If he seemed stoic, it was sometimes just the stiffness. If he looked haunted, it was often just the fatigue. He adapted, scene by scene, to the body that was slipping away from him, like a man learning to sail a boat as it sinks. Even his own family wasn't fully in on the reality. His children, including Vanessa and Corin, noted his decline but never fully understood the depth of his concealment. Parkinson's wasn't something he wore on his sleeve. It was something he folded into the costume and hoped wouldn't show under the lights. He once said that the actor's job is to reflect human frailty. Ironically, he never allowed anyone to see his. And then came Richard Burton, a man who spoke like thunder but slowly drowned in the bottle he couldn't put down. 5. Richard Burton. Richard Burton spoke like God on a hangover. His voice, that velvet and gravel thundercloud, could baptize a stage or damn a camera lens. It wasn't just distinctive. It was elemental. You didn't hear Richard Burton. You weathered him. Audiences thought it was raw talent. What they didn't know was how much damage it took to sound that divine. Burton drank like someone trying to rewrite his own DNA. It wasn't just a vice. It was his second bloodstream. From the outside, he was the epitome of Welsh masculinity. Fierce, poetic, volcanic. But internally, he was quietly being hollowed out by the very thing that made him seem indestructible. His alcoholism wasn't a scandal. It was an institution. Something baked into his legend. Something half celebrated, half tragic. Like watching a lion slowly drown in his own roar. The drinking wrecked his voice, of course. That godlike resonance began to fray. His vocal cords, once capable of reciting Shakespeare with biblical menace, started to fail him. The irony is almost too cruel. The man best known for his voice was slowly losing the ability to use it. But that wasn't all. Years of sustained alcohol abuse also brought chronic pain, exhaustion, and bouts of paranoia that were quietly swept under the red carpet. He soldiered on, of course. He always did. Directors worked around him. Editors protected him. Co-stars admired him. And the audience? Well, the audience only ever saw the myth. And yet, in those final performances, you can feel it. That tension between power and collapse. That tragic weight behind the eyes. His face aged in time-lapse. His voice cracked like old wood. His timing, once razor-sharp, became erratic. And still, he gave everything. Because that's what legends do. They burn down the temple with themselves inside. His decline wasn't hidden. But it wasn't truly understood either. Because people didn't want to see Richard Burton suffer. They wanted to see him command. And command he did. Right up until the moment he couldn't. Which brings us to Charles Laughton. A man who didn't command the stage with power, but with discomfort, mostly his own. 6. Charles Laughton. Charles Laughton never looked like he belonged in Hollywood, or London, or anywhere with mirrors. He had a face that seemed carved by indecision, somewhere between tragic clown and furious archbishop. But behind that mask was a performer who knew something most actors never admit. Shame is its own kind of spotlight. Laughton suffered, not loudly, not dramatically, but privately, in ways that shaped every glance, every line, every strange twitching smile. He had a lifelong struggle with gastrointestinal illness, likely a form of Crohn's or a related inflammatory disease, which left him in constant physical discomfort. This wasn't the glamorous suffering of addiction or the romantic kind of melancholy that makes for tortured genius headlines. No, this was slow, dull, humiliating pain, the kind that makes the body feel like an enemy and the mind like a hostage. He also battled profound body dysmorphia, Laughton hated the way he looked. Hated it with the kind of quiet venom that never quite drains out of a performance. He was famous for his unique features, but to him, they were deformities. Every close-up was a punishment. Every costume fitting, a trial. His weight fluctuated constantly, as did his self-worth. And yet, somehow, he was electric. He played Quasimodo not as a monster, but as a mirror. He played judges and tyrants and murderers, like they all had something to hide, because he knew what it was to hide everything. His roles weren't escapes from his pain. They were opportunities to use it, to turn discomfort into gravity, to make his internal chaos external and unforgettable. His colleagues spoke of him with awe. Audiences adored him. But Laughton, to the end, saw only distortion, only error. In his own eyes, he was a grotesque who happened to act. To everyone else, he was one of the most quietly terrifying talents the screen had ever seen. And while he never found peace with his reflection, he did leave behind a truth few performers dared to admit. Sometimes, greatness is just a well-performed scream from inside the wrong body. Which takes us to Alastair Sim, whose posture whispered secrets his mouth never dared to say. 7. Alastair Sim. Alastair Sim always looked like he knew something you didn't. Not in the smug schoolmaster way, though he played plenty of those, but in the unsettling, whisper-behind-a-curtain kind of way. His characters were rarely loud, but they were aware. He had a smile that never promised safety, and a voice like a velvet trapdoor. You watched him and thought, this man's hiding something. And you were right. Sim had a condition rarely mentioned during his lifetime, a pronounced curvature of the spine, kyphosis. It gave him a distinctive gait, a peculiar slouch, and a silhouette that directors learned to light carefully. This was long before diversity campaigns or accessibility clauses. Back then, you just kept your posture to yourself, which he did, and then some. His physicality became his signature. He leaned into the stoop, turned his curved frame into something ghostly. Sim didn't overcome his spinal condition. He weaponized it. Those hunched shoulders, that sideways head tilt, the slow, creeping entrances into frame, they became the architecture of his performances. Every movement was a riddle. Was he plotting something, mourning something, dodging something? Sim never talked much about his health. He rarely talked about anything, actually. Reclusive, private, and famously elusive in interviews, he let the performances do the speaking. And in those roles, especially as Scrooge in A Christmas Carol, you see the man playing with pain, not exploiting it, not milking it, just living with it on screen in a way that made it feel like the camera had caught him in a vulnerable moment he hadn't meant to share. There's a strange kind of power in being off balance, in never standing up quite straight. Sim had that power. The audience could never quite predict him, because his physical rhythm was off-kilter. He walked like a man dodging invisible furniture. And sometimes, that's exactly what acting is. Avoiding the things you can't acknowledge. And if Sim moved like a man trying not to fall, Ralph Richardson moved like a man who could no longer hear the ground coming toward him. 8. Ralph Richardson. Ralph Richardson had the voice of an oracle and the eyebrows of a thunderstorm. He spoke like the English language had been written for him personally, then entrusted to no one else. In an era of grand performances and carefully crafted personas, Richardson was the eccentric's eccentric. Brilliant, unreadable, and always a little bit somewhere else. But by the end of his career, somewhere else wasn't just a mood, it was a symptom. Richardson suffered from chronic hearing loss later in life. Not the theatrical kind where one misheard line adds comic relief. The kind that erodes trust, timing, and intimacy. The kind that makes a stage partner's breathless cue sound like wind through a keyhole. For someone whose work depended on precision, it was devastating. And yet, true to form, Richardson turned the handicap into a performance note. He wore discreet hearing aids during productions, concealed behind wigs, costumes, and that famously wily charm. He adjusted his style to rely more on visual cues and emotional intuition. Lines weren't just recited, they were felt, sensed, stitched together from fragments of audible reality. He developed an uncanny ability to appear perfectly in sync, even when he wasn't. Because what he lacked in literal hearing, he made up for in attention. Directors noticed, so did co-stars. But nobody said much, because Richardson, even half-deaf and quietly struggling, was still Ralph Richardson. The eccentricity that had once seemed like affectation now doubled as camouflage. Those dramatic pauses, hearing delay, that lingering glance, processing time, that baffled expression? Authentic. And still, the man dazzled. In the end, what people remembered wasn't the lost hearing. It was the presence. That ineffable, unknowable Richardson-ness that made even silence feel like it was being narrated from another realm. And while he strained to hear his fellow actors, the world strained to understand him. Which brings us to John Gielgud, whose every line was memorized perfectly, not because he wanted to impress you, but because his own thoughts were too loud to ignore. 9. John Gielgud. John Gielgud spoke like a man trying to make peace with language itself. Every syllable he delivered had been weighed, measured, and given permission to live. He was the high priest of British theatre, sharp, musical, regal, and somehow always slightly embarrassed to be standing there. You could give him a phone book and he'd turn it into iambic pentameter. But beneath the poise and polish was a mind that never quite turned off, and a soul that never quite settled. Gielgud suffered, quietly and perpetually, from severe anxiety and depression, lifelong companions he carried like invisible stage props. At a time when such things were considered both shameful and self-indulgent, he did what many of his generation did. He covered it with elegance. Not denial exactly, but a kind of curated discretion. There was the public man, witty, charming, arch, and then there was the inner Gielgud, pacing a private room filled with ghosts. His anxiety wasn't the flustered kind. It was clinical, chronic, and corrosive. It manifested in obsessive rehearsing, constant fear of failure, and a tendency to disappear emotionally even while delivering brilliance on stage. Friends noticed. Colleagues whispered. But Gielgud just pressed on, mastering roles with precision that bordered on compulsion. His Hamlet was considered definitive, not because it was loud or revolutionary, but because it was controlled, down to the breath. There's something heartbreakingly ironic about a man who could play kings but couldn't conquer his own thoughts, who could deliver soliloquies about death with chilling clarity, but struggled to feel joy in the applause. Fame didn't soothe him. It only added more rooms to the mental labyrinth. Yet through it all, he remained a towering figure, not in spite of his internal storms, but perhaps because of them. There's a strange kind of clarity that comes from darkness. Gielgud had that. You watched him not to be dazzled, but to feel understood, even when he wasn't saying what hurt. And then there was Trevor Howard, who didn't need introspection to feel tormented. He had a bottle, a diagnosis, and a quiet war going on under every calm exterior. 10. Trevor Howard. Trevor Howard had the face of a man who'd already survived the worst part of the story and was now just trying to get through the epilogue. Stoic, weathered, and never quite at rest, he built a career playing morally complicated men who always seemed to be one glance away from a full confession. But the real confession was his own, and he never gave it. Howard struggled with alcoholism for most of his adult life. Not the flamboyant kind that lands headlines, but the slow, grinding dependency that carves out your energy and dulls your light. His liver bore the brunt of it, developing chronic disease that he worked hard to keep under wraps. It wasn't just health, it was dignity. His career, carefully curated, emotionally precise, depended on the illusion of control, even when his body was losing it. You can see it in his later performances. Not weakness exactly, but a kind of internal drift. A slowness that wasn't acting. A fatigue that couldn't be rehearsed away. Directors noticed. Scenes were adjusted. But Howard never asked for sympathy. He delivered his lines, hit his marks, and left the truth off screen. In Brief Encounter, he played a man aching for connection. Off camera, he was slipping further into solitude. In Mutiny on the Bounty, he portrayed authority slowly unraveling. In reality, his own health was beginning to follow suit. The brilliance of Trevor Howard wasn't that he hid his suffering. It's that he wrapped it in such tight restraint. You almost believed it was part of the character. He never courted pity. He didn't give interviews about the cost. Instead, he let the cracks show just enough, like an actor performing through fog, not to be seen clearly, but to be felt truthfully. And that's what made him unforgettable. He wasn't trying to shine, he was trying to endure. Which brings us to Denholm Elliott, whose performances were warm, funny, and human, even as a secret diagnosis shadowed every moment. 11. Denholm Elliott. Denholm Elliott was one of those actors who always seemed to be in the room, not commanding it, not stealing it, just existing there with a kind of effortless human warmth. He wasn't a star in the old studio sense. He was better, a character actor who made every character feel real. You didn't watch Denholm Elliott to escape. You watched him to remember what people actually look like when they're trying not to fall apart, which is what makes his story all the more quietly devastating. In the late 1980s, Elliott was diagnosed with HIV. At the time, it was more than a medical crisis. It was a cultural death sentence. The stigma was brutal. The assumptions, louder than the facts. And for an actor in the public eye, the safest option was silence. So Elliott said nothing. He kept acting. He kept smiling. He kept making audiences feel at home, even as his own life narrowed into secrecy. You wouldn't know it from watching him. He brought the same offbeat charm and emotional depth to every performance. From the bumbling curator in Indiana Jones to the disillusioned gentleman in British dramas that always smelled faintly of brandy and repressed trauma. But behind the scenes, his illness was progressing. The energy was harder to conjure, the work more physically taxing, and still, he never made it about him. He once said acting was about putting on the mask that lets you be yourself. It's telling. The real Denholm Elliott wasn't in the roles. He was in the gaps between them, the pauses, the weariness in the smile, the slight wince behind the laugh. He knew how to portray vulnerability because he lived with it every day, and he did it with quiet courage, without turning it into performance. He passed away in 1992. Most headlines were polite. Few mentioned what he'd endured. Fewer still acknowledged the dignity with which he endured it. Because that's how he lived. Honestly, but never loudly. And then there's Donald Pleasence, whose one good eye saw more than most men ever dared to face. 12. Donald Pleasence. Donald Pleasence had a face made for fear. Not his own, but yours. Bald, bug-eyed, and endlessly unsettling, he became the cinematic shorthand for unease. He didn't play villains so much as haunt them. Even when his characters weren't evil, they felt like they'd been awake too long, like they knew something terrible and had decided not to tell you, yet. But Pleasence didn't learn fear from scripts. He learned it the hard way during World War II. As a Royal Air Force crew member, he was shot down, captured by the Germans, and held in a prisoner of war camp. The experience left him scarred, mentally and physically. One of those scars, rarely acknowledged, was the permanent loss of sight in one eye. It never came back. He simply adjusted. Quietly. Like he always did. His damaged eye became part of his mystique. Not overtly, no eye patches or melodrama, but subtly, in the way he held his head, the way he focused just slightly off-center. He turned asymmetry into character. His performances were always a little tilted, like the camera was off by a degree, and that made you uneasy, even if you didn't know why. But it wasn't just the vision. Pleasence carried trauma like a second skin. The war lived in his bones, and yet he never advertised it. He preferred roles that let him channel that buried tension into something useful, something memorable. In The Great Escape, he played a POW slowly going blind, a character twist eerily close to his own reality. In Halloween, he became the human counterbalance to evil, a man permanently on the edge of panic. Pleasence never looked the part of a leading man, and he didn't care. He carved out a place for oddness, for menace, for quiet, unflinching intensity. His eye might have failed him, but his gaze never did. And then there was Jack Hawkins, whose voice was once his weapon, until the silence took it back. 13. Jack Hawkins. Jack Hawkins didn't just have a voice, he had the voice. A smooth, steely baritone that made colonels sound reasonable and commandments sound inevitable. His diction was crisp, his delivery effortless, and his presence radiated calm authority. In a post-war Britain desperate for something, someone, to believe in, Hawkins became the on-screen embodiment of upright masculinity, stoic, noble, square-jawed, the kind of man who'd never let you down. So naturally, life let him down first. In the 1960s, Hawkins developed throat cancer, the kind that doesn't care how many speeches you've memorized. Radiation treatments failed, surgery followed. Eventually, doctors had to remove his larynx entirely. The voice that had carried a generation through courtroom dramas, battlefield epics, and stoic farewells was gone. Irrevocably. But Hawkins didn't quit. He couldn't. Acting wasn't just his job. It was the scaffolding of his identity. So he returned to the screen, post-surgery, voiceless but unbowed. He took roles where his voice was dubbed by others, Charles Gray, Robert Rietti, skilled actors who could mimic the cadence, but never the weight. And yet, Hawkins kept showing up, fully present, fully committed. Even as the one thing he'd built his career on was being piped in through a speaker. It's hard to overstate the quiet dignity of that choice. Many actors would have disappeared. He didn't. He stood there, filmed scene after scene, saying nothing, and still managed to command the frame. He became a silent titan. His eyes did the work. His posture, the punctuation. The voice was gone, but the presence was deafening. Hawkins proved that identity isn't always about the parts of us that function. Sometimes it's about how we carry what's been taken. In the end, he wasn't just an actor with a missing voice. He was an icon who refused to let silence mean surrender. And then came Ian Carmichael, a man whose comedy was light as air, even as his joints turned to stone beneath him. 14. Ian Carmichael. Ian Carmichael made it all look so easy. The laughable aristocrats, the bumbling charm, the upper-class twits with hearts of gold and brains made of fog. He was a master of the cheerful fool, a staple of British comedy that never quite went out of fashion because Carmichael made sure it never would. You didn't watch him for gravitas. You watched him for timing, rhythm, and that absurd optimism that somehow made the audience feel like everything might be all right, which is what makes his hidden struggle all the more poignant. Behind that buoyant energy, Carmichael battled debilitating arthritis, the kind that creeps in quietly, settles into the joints, and turns everyday movement into negotiation. It wasn't loud, it wasn't scandalous, but it was relentless. And for a performer whose success depended on nimbleness, physical and comedic, arthritis was a cruel twist. He never played it up. You won't find interviews where he discusses pain, or rehearsals where he collapsed dramatically in frustration. Carmichael managed it the way so many of his generation did, with a polite smile and quiet adaptation. Movements became more economical. Stage directions were adjusted. Directors worked around him, and audiences never knew. If anything, the slight stiffness in his later roles added another layer to his characters. The older gentleman clinging to grace in a world too fast for them. His performances gained depth, not in spite of the pain, but because of it. He wasn't just playing aging charmers. He was one. And the subtlety with which he folded his real limitations into the fabric of his comedy made his work feel more lived in than ever. Carmichael was never flashy. That was the trick. He was the kind of actor who made you feel like he'd always been there, like part of the furniture of British culture. But the truth is, he stayed there through sheer grit and practiced elegance, long after his body suggested he step aside. And then there was Harry Andrews, whose stormy silences weren't always scripted, and whose deepest battles were the ones no one dared to name. 15. Harry Andrews. Harry Andrews looked like he was carved out of cliffside. His face was all granite and storm, his voice gravel dipped in command. He played military men, patriarchs, judges, the kind of roles where a single raised eyebrow could silence a courtroom or crush a cadet. You didn't cast Harry Andrews to be relatable. You cast him to be immovable. But beneath that iron exterior was a man carrying something far heavier than any uniform or gavel. Andrews suffered from chronic depression, the kind that doesn't melt down in public, but instead hardens into silence. The kind that stays quiet in makeup chairs, follows you onto set, and whispers during lunch breaks. He never spoke openly about it. Almost no one did back then, especially not a man whose entire persona was built on control. But you can see it, if you know where to look. In the stillness, in the pauses between lines, in the slightly clenched jaw that reads like restraint, but might actually be grief. His characters often felt wounded in ways the script never explained. Men haunted by wars that hadn't happened, or tragedies too deep for dialogue. And perhaps that's because Andrews was using the roles not to express himself, but to contain himself. He was known for his discipline, never missed a cue, always prepared, always professional. But some co-stars later noted his absences. Not physical, but emotional. He could be distant, withdrawn, brilliant, but unreachable, as if he was always standing at the edge of something no one else could see. Depression doesn't always look like collapse. Sometimes it looks like composure taken to the point of self-erasure. Andrews kept performing well into his later years, never letting the mask crack. But there's a quiet heroism in that. Not the cinematic kind, but the quiet endurance of a man who kept showing up, even when his own mind told him not to. And then came Kenneth More, a man who smiled through it all, even as his body slowly rewrote his script without asking. 16. Kenneth More. Kenneth More was the man you wanted to be stranded with, on a lifeboat, at a cocktail party, or in a Sunday afternoon war film. He radiated competence, warmth, and that very specific kind of British optimism that made you believe everything could be fixed with a wink and a cigarette. More was cheerful without being naive, charming without being smug. But what most people didn't realize was how much effort it took to keep that smile on screen, especially as Parkinson's disease began to steal it from him. The symptoms started quietly, as they often do. A missed beat here, a stiffness in the hand there, a tremor, small enough to hide in the flourish of a gesture. But Parkinson's isn't interested in your schedule. It doesn't care about matinee performances or tightly blocked camera movements. It creeps forward. It reclaims ground. And More, the ultimate man of action, was slowly being trapped inside a body that wouldn't obey. He didn't announce it. There was no press release, no public reckoning. He simply adapted. He took smaller roles, chose projects with fewer physical demands, allowed the characters to lean more on reflection than reaction. His once boundless energy became more contemplative, and though the sparkle in his eye never fully disappeared, it took more work to keep it lit. Parkinson's is a cruel disease for an actor, not because it changes what you can say, but because it changes how you say it. the timing, the posture, the control of expression. All the invisible tools of performance begin to slip away. And yet, More kept performing long after most would have stopped. Not out of vanity, but out of a deep belief in showing up, in contributing, in not letting the curtain fall too early. And in his final appearances, there's a different kind of bravery. Not the dashing kind he built his career on, but the quiet courage of a man determined to face the closing act with grace. Which brings us to James Robertson Justice, who didn't go quietly, didn't go easily, and didn't go unnoticed, even when half his body tried to quit on him. 17. James Robertson Justice. James Robertson Justice was less of an actor and more of a controlled detonation. He had a voice like rolling boulders and a beard that looked like it had its own postal code. Directors didn't cast him to blend in. They cast him to arrive like a storm. Whether he was playing bombastic surgeons, belligerent patriarchs, or roaring authority figures with blood pressure problems, he delivered every line like it was carved into stone and hurled from a mountaintop. And for most of his life, he looked indestructible. But he wasn't. Behind the Viking energy and barrel-chested performances, Justice was quietly waging a series of physical battles that would have brought most men to a halt. He suffered from severe hearing loss. An ironic twist, given the sheer volume with which he projected his characters. He often relied on lip reading and visual cues to keep pace with scenes, which made his timing even more impressive. What looked like commanding confidence was sometimes just a man focusing intensely enough to decode a co-star's mouth shape. But that was only the beginning. Later in life, Justice suffered multiple strokes, each one leaving him more diminished than the last. The man who had once bounded into rooms with volcanic force now struggled to move, to speak, even to remain upright, and yet his presence never truly disappeared. He kept returning to the screen, sometimes in reduced roles, sometimes in scenes tailored to his new limitations, but always with the same unflinching gaze. He was also diagnosed with a chronic neurological condition that further eroded his mobility. For a performer who had built a career on grand gestures and commanding volume, it must have felt like betrayal in slow motion. But Justice didn't rage publicly. He didn't recede into quiet dignity either. He simply kept showing up, broken, bruised, but still larger than life. Even in silence, he had gravity. And when the curtain finally closed, he left behind a strange legacy, a man remembered for booming excess, who carried so much silent suffering behind the scenes. Because sometimes the loudest man in the room is also the one fighting the hardest just to stand in it.